Hi, this is Kate Elliott. Thank you for joining us today on Narrative Worlds, and I am thrilled to have back my friend Malinda Lo. Malinda was with us 2 years ago. Is that correct? Yeah, I can't. Time has no meaning anymore.
No.
And where we talked about research, because at that time you were talking a lot about the research you'd done for your historical novel Last Night at the Telegraph Club. And in the interim between that conversation and this one, that very book won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature. Is that how that's
right.
The correct title?
Yeah.
Which is the lightning striking, right, of the title of today's, which is like when lightning strikes, what you can control in your writing career and what you can't. And I thought you would be perfect to bring back, because you now have seen kind of the midless career you were having, and then all of a sudden the changes that happened, and maybe what changes didn't happen because of it. So I wanted to quickly say to the people joining us, please, we'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then please ask questions in the Q&A box. I can't follow the chat because I can't multitask. But Nathan Lucas, our tech guy, will be following the chat. Okay, so Malinda, I was gonna start by asking you to talk a little bit about your career, especially how you entered the field, how things went at the beginning, maybe some stuff didn't go so well, you know, what you thought was going to happen. And then, yeah, but I know, right? We've been there with the book. We've been there with the book that never got a paperback version.
Yeah.
Because the hardcover didn't sell well enough. I mean, everything. And then all of a sudden, how that changed with the success of Last Night. So,
Okay. So, all right, strap in. Here we go. So, my first book came out in 2009, and it was a young adult novel called Ash, it's a sapphic retelling of Cinderella. Only back then I called it a lesbian retelling of Cinderella, because sapphic was not used yet in that way. But anyway, the point is, so that's a big change. So when Ash came out in 2009, it was an interesting time. I actually got a lot of support for that book. It came out from Little Brown Books for Young Readers, and it was what they call a focus title. I didn't know that till after the fact. So what that meant was I went to the school library events. I went to the American Library Association, the National Council for Teachers of English. I did like school and library promotion. Like there was advertising for that book, which it rode on the coattails of Twilight. Okay, the 2009 is 2 years after Twilight came out, and Little Brown published Twilight, and there was money to promote books. So I really benefited from Stephanie Meyer's massive best-selling success. Okay, so Ash did pretty well, actually, but it was my first book, so I didn't know that. I didn't know that I was getting promotion that other people were not getting. I was in like a debut author group, and I noticed that I got stuff that other people didn't get, but I wasn't really sure why. You know, I really had no idea what was happening. So it was an amazing experience. Ash was an Andre Nord Award finalist when it came out. It was a William Morris Award finalist. That's an ALA award. It was a Mythopoeic Society finalist. It got a lot of awards, but it didn't win anything. Okay, so that's 2009. My next book, my second novel, which is your second novel is terrible to write, right? So it was really hard for me to write it. It came out in 2011. It's called Huntress. It was kind of a Chinese-inspired young adult fantasy novel. It did not do as well as Ash. Okay, it did okay, and it did okay in its way, but it didn't earn out. Like Ash earned out in a couple of years, and it was a pretty good advance at that time. So Huntress did not earn out. It has still not earned out. It's like, what is it? 12 years later? No, we have not earned out yet. Okay, so it came out in 2011. Then my third book adaptation came out in 2012, so the year later.
Yeah.
That was a science fiction novel. It was like my X-Files inspired science fiction thriller, was a duology. That was in 2012. Book 2 came out in 2013, Inheritance. So each of my books did worse than the one before, right? So Ash did good, Huntress was less, Adaptation was less, Inheritance was basically like, nobody's read Inheritance. Okay, so it did worse and worse and worse. And at the same time, you may be familiar with this, Kate, if your sales are declining, the publisher puts less marketing support behind the next one, and so on and so forth. So it's not the greatest of experiences. And by the time Inheritance came out, my 4th book in 2012 or 2013, I knew that this was a problem. Like, I knew that I had a bad sales history at that point, but I didn't know what to do. So I had this idea to write this contemporary novel. It was still YA-ish, but it was about an 18-year-old girl who has an affair with with a slightly older woman.
Hold on, can I want to ask you a question, or
Yeah.
I want to kind of introduce something. So at that point, at 4 books, that's a point where I think a certain number of people think they can't make it and they quit, or they stop writing for years. So
Yeah.
I just want to note that at this point, you're still saying to yourself, I have an idea for another book. So
Oh yeah, I'm still
in other words, you're still going.
I'm still going because I want to point out I had the benefit of being married to my wife, who is a lawyer, who has a job with a salary and healthcare. So I had financial stability and I could still keep going. So this idea I had for this contemporary realistic novel was extremely different than anything I had ever done. So I thought, this is totally different. Maybe I'll do something totally different. Of course, I had that bad sales history, and publishing doesn't like it when you switch genres. So
No, we want the same as that other one, only the same.
Right. They had a really hard time when I went from fantasy to science fiction. Okay, so from fantasy and science fiction to realism was like really hard, I think. And I still wanted to use my name. Like I could have tried to change my name, but you know what? I'm a Leo. I'm Malinda Lo. I'm not changing my name.
I did. I'm also a Leo. I did change my name, and I didn't care, but that's for different reasons.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I wrote this novel. My agent at the time was like, well, I asked my agent at the time, should I do this? It's like, it's kind of a weird novel for YA, you know, it's not real. I don't really see this kind of book in YA. And she was like, well, if you want to write it, you should do it. So I wrote it. And then it went on submission in 2014. Nobody would buy it. It was rejected by like 24 editors in New York in YA, which was basically everyone. Okay. They all rejected it. And they were all, I mean, there was the sales history that was bad. That some of them had kind of homophobic responses. They were very uncomfortable with the sex in it. There was sex in it. So they didn't like that. I know, and shocking. So they really didn't like that. So this was a very, very difficult experience for me to go through. It was really hard. But I did not want to give up because the only thing I've ever wanted to do is be a writer. So I'm like, what else am I supposed to do, right? So I went and found an editor that I thought would not be scared of the sex. And I actually met him at a library conference. I didn't tell him I had this book. He was working at a very small press at the time in Minneapolis. So he wasn't big time. Okay. So I met him. I had a dinner with him arranged by Sarah Zarr, a fellow author, and a couple other authors. And Sarah Zarr got sick and couldn't go. So I ended up going to dinner with him and a few other people. I liked him. So when I got back home, I asked my agent to submit this book to him. And she was like, he works for this dinky press. Are you sure? And I was like, yes. So she sent him the manuscript. He liked it, and he was in the middle of moving to Dutton Books for Young Readers, which is an internet penguin. Okay.
Yeah.
They published John Green. So there was only one editor at Dutton, Julie Strauss Gable, John Green's editor. He would be the second editor. It's a very small imprint, but it's at Penguin, and it was kind of a prestigious imprint. So when my agent found this out, she was much happier. So this guy's name is Andrew Carr, and we actually had a conversation about this book at the time, and he had really good ideas for it, but he couldn't buy it. I think that he was not allowed to buy it at that time, probably for many of these reasons. It was a quiet book. It had sex in it. I had a bad sales history. So he asked me if I had any other ideas. And
so I want to stop here for a minute again and point out that you're doing what you can control, right? You're not only continuing to write, but then you were looking for an editor and you made sure you could meet him. Yeah.
Yes.
Without, not in a creepy, imposing way,
right.
But in a,
I didn't tell him about the book when I met him.
Yeah, right.
So, but by that time I'd been in YA long enough that I knew of the reputations of various editors. Yeah. And I knew that he had been editing books that were winning awards and that were very edgy. Okay. So I was like, he's the one to send it to. So anyway, he couldn't buy it. So I came up with this idea for a psychological thriller. And I came up with the idea on the phone with him. He was literally like, what have you read lately that you liked or didn't like? And we talked about reading Tana French, who's this Irish crime novelist, and she had written a book about private school girls and murder, and it was called The Secret Place, and I liked it, but I was like, well, I would do certain things differently, you know. So I came up with an idea for this psychological thriller, and he bought it. I just wrote a proposal for it, and that was called A Line in the Dark, and that came out in 2017. So meanwhile, I left my agent. I got a new agent, okay, who Andrew connected me with. And I also had known at the time about reputations of various agents in YA, because I'd been in there for like 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, a long time, seems like. So I knew who I wanted to work with, and Andrew connected us, and I went and met this agent in New York. He actually lives in LA, but he was in New York for a meeting. So I was like, I'm going to go to New York and meet him. And I was planning to meet a couple other agents too, but they somehow didn't work out. Anyway, I met him. I immediately connected with him. I told him about this short story I had been working on for an anthology of historical YA fiction. This short story was called New Year. It was about a Chinese American girl named Lily who lives in San Francisco in the 1950s. And she's kind of obsessed with rocket science, but she also thinks she might be a lesbian. So I had this long conversation with Michael, this agent, about it. And he was like, this could be a novel. And I didn't really want to make it a novel at that point. I thought it was just a short story, but he was right, because I kept thinking about it, and it was very clear to me that I had a lot more to say about Lily. So thanks to Michael, I wrote a book proposal based on this short story. And then Michael took that to Andrew, and Andrew bought it within like 2 weeks. So I then had to write a historical novel set in the 50s. And I didn't know anything about the 50s. So you all can watch the previous time I was on here, and we can talk about research. I had to do a lot of research. Yeah. Because I really knew nothing about the 50s. So.
And you also, know how to do research too.
I do, because I'm a failed academic. So
yes, exactly. Yeah.
I have done research in my life.
So for anyone who hasn't seen that video, there's actually a lot of useful information there on how to do research, how to really dig into something. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did all that research. I wrote the novel. And at the same time that Andrew bought Telegraph Club, he said, remember that other novel I couldn't buy? Now I want to buy that too. So he bought those 2 books together for very low advances. Okay. It's 2017. I didn't have a good sales history. No. You know, I was like, okay, good. I want to work with this guy because he's a good editor, and I wanted to become a better writer. That's my
Sorry,
dog.
I'm distracted by,
That's my dog. There she is.
look at her. Look
That's
at those
my,
ears.
I
I'm
know.
sorry, the ears.
She's up here with me today. So,
Okay, sorry for the
oh
interruption.
no, it's okay. She's very important. So what else? So I wrote, so he bought the two books. He bought the two books. We all agreed I should write Telegraph Club first because it was 2017. Trump had just been elected. We were like, oh, this story about set in the 1950s with McCarthyism and anti-immigrant sentiment, it's very timely. So
Yeah, for sure.
you know, it took me 3 years to write it though. So it was quite a bit later. It was like Trump was basically over by the time it came out. But we did that first. And, you know, for the first time in my life, I remember when I finished Last Night at the Telegraph Club, when it was going to copy edits, I thought to myself, I did a good job with this book. I remember feeling that way. I remember feeling so confident that I had done my very best with that book. I had not felt that way before. I have not felt that way since. So
you know, I've told you, haven't I, that when I read it, I thought, because I didn't tell you at the time, I told you it was an excellent book, but when I read it, I thought, stuff's going to happen with this book.
Yeah, I didn't.
When you got on the long list for the National Book Award, I'm not new agey at all. I thought she's going to win. Well, I don't even know why. That maybe just because I know you and I wanted you to win, but I just had a feeling. And it's interesting to me to hear that you felt something when you finished it.
I did, but I didn't know it would win the National Book Award. Like
well, who knows that? Nobody knows that, right?
I did when the long list was announced, I didn't know that it was being announced that day. Like my editor called me and he was like, congratulations. And I was like, for what? We had this conversation for like a couple minutes. I thought he was talking about something else. And then he was like, you don't even know. I had no idea. So that was my last moment of ignorance though, because after that, I knew that this book would get stuff. I mean, by that point, it had gotten 8 starred reviews, which is like astonishing.
I didn't even know there were 8 trade journals.
Oh, there are 9
starred reviews.
There are 9. I didn't get one from School Library Journal, which panned it twice.
What?
But by the end of the year, they had re-reviewed it and put it in their best books of the year.
I'm sorry, that is so funny.
Yes, it's
so funny.
Hilarious. So when it got on the long list, I knew stuff was going to happen, but I didn't know if it was going to get on the short list. Because so the National Book Awards, it's like a reality show or something. They'd start off with a long list of like 10 finalists, and then they weed it down to 5, and then there's the night of the award where they pick one, right? But this was also during COVID still, and so the awards were actually on Zoom. And so they were in this. I was here in my office for the National Book Awards, and so it won, which was I don't know, it was shocking to me. I honestly think I've only really come to understand what this means like in the last couple of weeks, because since it won, I have been on this nonstop series of events. Like there was like media, there was a lot of media. I had hired a publicist before the National Book Awards to promote the book on its paperback release, because I felt that my publisher had not promoted it enough when it came out as a hardcover. So I wanted to give it something more because I felt like it was a good book and I wanted to get some press. And I felt like it was a crossover book. Okay, like I felt that if adults knew about it, they would like it. And
I think it absolutely is a crossover book.
Yeah, and in the UK, it's published as an adult novel. So in the US though, when it comes to publicity for young adult books, there's very little media attention for young adult books, right? So if I wanted to get any, I kind of felt like I had to hire someone. So I did. And so I had a publicist working with me that I was paying during the National Book Award stuff. So I got quite a lot of, I got some media, I did a lot of podcasts. So in addition to that, I started to get speaking invitations. So then it came out in paperback in January 2022, actually December 28th, 2021, weirdly. And so Telegraph Club had done well before it won the National Book Award, but it really didn't really pick up until the paperback, because I will tell you, Barnes and Noble selected it for their book club in January 2022.
Yeah.
That enabled the book to finally get on the New York Times bestseller list. It had not been on there the entire first year. Like, it did well, but it wasn't on the New York Times list until it came.
Was November 2021 the National Book Award?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was the National Book Award. And then in January, it was a Barnes and Noble Book Club selection. And then it stayed on the bestseller list, the paperback bestseller list, for like 6 months. So it was never like at the top, but it was like on it. And paperback is a full month's worth of sales. So that was very good. That was very good. Like, and so with the increasing sales, you know, and the awards. Oh, and then there in January 2022, there were all the American Library Association awards, and then it got a bunch more there. So I got all these speaking invitations. I started working with a speaking agent. And then in 2022, which was only last year, I did 43 events.
Oh,
Okay?
wow.
I mean, some of them were virtual, but I traveled to, like, felt like everywhere. And at the same time, in October 2022, I had another book out. This was the book that had been rejected by everyone in 2014. It's called A Scatter of Light. And it came out in the fall. And it's connected to Telegraph Club. And the reason it's connected is because of this convoluted publishing history, where I wrote Scatter first, then I wrote Telegraph Club. And while I was writing Telegraph Club, I knew I would be coming back to Scatter, and I realized they were connected. So when I went back to revise Scatter, I could then, you know, do the connecting. So anyway, it was a complicated process, but it came out in the fall. And because Telegraph Club had done so well, my publisher made it a lead title, which is like completely shocking for a book that could not get sold. It is now a lead title.
2014, yeah.
They sent me on a book tour. I've never gone on a publisher sponsored book tour before. People came to my events. Is always shocking as a writer. Like,
because we've both been to events where there were 2 people, right?
Yeah. And it's like, I did not expect people to actually come. Like, in Berkeley, I spoke at Mrs. Dalloway's, and that was a sold out event. I could not believe it. There were like so many people there. I was so shocked by this. Okay. So I was doing a Scatter of Light book tour. I'm still doing Telegraph Club events. And then the 2022 ends, and I took a break for like 3 or 4 months, no events. And
which is why you're here in April, because you said I'm doing nothing from January
Right.
through March.
And I was so burned out. And before I had taken that break, I'd already pre-scheduled more events starting in April. So like starting March 31st, I had a week where I did 3 events, like big ones. And now there's this, and I have a list now. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more events before I am done. And then I'm literally not doing any more events. I mean, until I finish my next book. I mean, the problem is A Scatter of Light is coming out as a paperback this fall, so I don't know whether I'll have to do anything for that. I'm okay with doing events to like promote a new book or whatever. It's like the speaking tour stuff is very draining. So I'm not doing that after this for a good long while.
And in a way, now you have the luxury, I guess, of saying no, right?
Well, yeah, but the thing is, literally, I was, how I was saying, like, I don't think I quite figured out what winning the National Book Award meant until a couple weeks ago. It's literally because now I have realized I don't want to do these speaking events anymore. It was like really weighing me down and making me feel really exhausted. So when I have finally gotten through enough of them. For the remaining events that I have, I know what I'm going to do. I have the speeches mostly prepared, so it's fine. That was like a weight lifted. And then I was like, oh, I can get back to my business of doing things. But I have always had this hustle mentality where I feel like I have to
Yeah.
be turning out something else. And
Yeah.
so I had these ideas that I could write a nonfiction essay and try to get it published in like a mainstream publication in time for A Scatter of Light to come out in paperback. I had these ideas. I mean, I wanted to write these nonfiction essays to like be in the media more, right? And I started writing it last week, and I wrote a draft of an essay, and I was like, this is so boring. I don't want to read this. No one's going to want to read this. And I also realized I don't have to do it. It was like a mind blowing, because my entire career, like I started out as a freelance writer in the 2000s. So I've always been churning out essays and like think pieces. And I realized for the first time, I don't have to do this. I don't really know very many writers who do this. They mostly focus on their novels and work on the next one. But I have always the hustle. Like I have to get my name out there. And if I'm not writing another essay or think piece, I should be writing a short story and trying to get it published somewhere. But I have realized why am I doing that? Like now, I for the first time, I probably can decide to not do it and just work on my next book.
That's in a way the gift that National Book Award gave you,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's part of it. I want to come back to this, or I want to circle or dig deeper into this combination of hustle and desperation, right? Because we come into this field. We're so eager. We've been dreaming of writing, or we've always been writing. And I think it's normal for people to say, oh, I hope to get a New York Times bestselling book, or I hope to get a movie deal, or I hope to get a prestigious book award, or whatever it might be, or sell more than 2 books, or sell one book, selling one book to a trade publisher, or self-publishing a series that does well. I mean, all those things are dreams, but there's so much. So we hustle because we want to do it, and we're desperate. We hustle because we're desperate, and we feel like if we start running at all, then everything's going to collapse. I know that feeling. I deal with that feeling all the time. I've got to keep doing more. I need to do more. I need to write more so I can get more out there, because otherwise the whole house of cards is going to go over.
Yes. That's exactly how I feel. That's how I felt for 20 years, right? Yeah. As a professional writer, you're just hustling to like get the next gig. And I already have my next gig. And I'm just like, why am I putting all these things? Why am I doing these things like events and trying to write essays? I'm putting obstacles in the way of me actually doing the thing I want to do. Because you can't write 2 things at the same time. Like you know what I mean? You have to take those hours to work on the essay. And those hours are hours you're not spent working on the novel. And the hours you spent traveling to speak at a conference are hours you are not spending writing that novel. And I don't want to do that anymore. I mean, I might have to do it again in the future, but I realized for this next book, I think I can just write it. I think I should. I think I should just write it.
There's a belief, especially in the days of social media, and it wasn't so true when I entered the field, because there were so few venues for it. It was almost easier back in the 90s when I started, because there was really nothing else you could do. Either you were a lead title, or I don't know if they had focus titles in those days, but focus titles are like the lead title is the book is going to, or you assume the publisher thinks is going to be a bestseller, has some really
they're going to make it that way,
or they're going to make it that way. And that's something that I think people don't. This is a tangent, but something that it took me a long time to understand, especially with the current debut culture, where a lot more effort is put into debut novels. It certainly wasn't when I started out. A debut novel was something that, that was just like your test run, right? But very few debut novels got any kind of big budget. But now I think people invest so much in their debut novel, and publishers invest so much. And I think it can take a while to understand that actually a lot of the debut novels that do really well, they had everything lined up behind them.
Yeah.
And the other debut novels were just them, they can throw a few fish into those waters and see which ones survive. It doesn't cost their bottom line that much to do that. And they don't know, right? So that's worth it to them to kind of seed that pond, right? But when you see a big book like burst on the scene and do well, it usually had a big budget behind it, a big print run.
Yeah.
And so it's not just this sense of, well, obviously it must have deserved it. It must have been super good. And which is not to say that it wasn't good. That's not to say that the books that do well aren't good. That has nothing to do with, it's not what this is about. Often they're just fine, but it doesn't mean that that's, so we think that we can control so much. If I hustle more, if I get on Twitter and do a post every, or if I do a newsletter, and if I write articles, if I do more. But in fact, it's not clear how much. What writers need to know what we can shift and what we can't, so we don't invest energy in things that aren't going to make any difference and are just going to drain us from the real work, which is writing the next book.
Yeah. And honestly, it was the experience of Telegraph Club that showed me that anything that I do is not going to move the needle, like in terms of sales, because I saw what did move the needle for sales. And that was TikTok, which I had nothing to do with. It was just this wonderful book talker who liked Telegraph Club, and she liked it and she made a video, and that moved sales significantly. And when the publishers saw that, they paid her to make another video. Okay.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
Book Talk, which had nothing to do with me, I didn't do anything with it. Like, no, I had no input into that. Also, what else moved the sales? Well, winning the National Book Award did a little bit. Not as much as Book Talk.
Really?
It did. And
that's no, but not as much as Book Talk.
No,
that's interesting. Yeah.
Again, I had nothing to do with that. I could not have advocated for that. There's no way. The other thing that did was I had an interview with NPR after winning the National Book Award. The NPR one was huge. That was a sales spike. And I had nothing to do with that either. They just decided to talk to me because I had won it. Like, this is not something you can orchestrate. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
not like you deciding you wanted to meet this editor and get a feel for him and then later approach him. That was something you had control over.
Right. Yeah. And Barnes and Noble, I had nothing to do with that. That was the Penguin sales team pitching the book to Barnes and Noble, and everything else, I'm sure, fed into Barnes and Noble deciding they wanted to have it as their book club selection. So these are the things that actually made a difference, a noticeable difference in my sales history. Did I have anything to do with them? No. So now that I know this, I'm just like, what if I could get an essay published in the New Yorker? Would that be good? Yeah, that would be great. But I mean, I'd have to write the essay. I'd have to figure out how to get it to them, because it's you can't just submit to the New Yorker. Okay. So I actually, have tried to figure this out, and it's hard. It's really hard. And I think 20 years ago, I had a dream of being published someplace like the New Yorker, but I'm not sure I still have that dream. Like, I wouldn't mind, but I don't think that's what I really want at this point. So
yeah, I mean, and there's also a thing about with the New Yorker. It's like, if you were to say to yourself, you know what, I really would like to go for that, not because I think it will boost my career, but for me personally. Yes. And that's a whole different reason to do something.
Exactly. And I also realized the stuff that I could get published would probably have to be along the lines of stuff I've written before. think pieces about being banned or racism or
Yeah,
homophobia.
yeah,
And you know what?
yeah.
I'm really tired of writing that stuff. I don't want to do it anymore. I just don't. And so why should I do it? There's literally no reason for me to do it. It's not going to improve my sales and it's not going to write my novel. So it's just, there's no reason. There's no reason to do it.
Yeah,
This-
unless again, a person wanted to do it for their own reasons, but you've already done it. It's the same thing for me with writing about, I wrote that, I don't know, time no longer has any meaning for me, but I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, I wrote a long essay for Tor.com about that history shows that we don't need to, that we can put women in all kinds of roles in epic fantasy. Everyone is saying, well, you can't have women in epic fantasy because they never did anything in the past. So it's just a long essay about all the things they did in the past and how you can do whatever you want. So, and after I wrote that, I was like, okay, I'm done. If anybody ever asks me again, I can just show them that essay. And I don't really want to write about it anymore. My books are my writing about it. My fiction is
Yes,
my writing about it.
exactly. My books are my writing about these things. And so I am anyway, I also quit Twitter like last fall when Elon Musk bought it. So not being on Twitter for like however long, since November, I think, end of November, that's been great. I have no desire to go back. And it also has removed some of the hustle culture from my daily life.
Yeah.
Like I don't see it as much. Like it's still on Instagram, but it's not as much as Twitter.
But Instagram is a different thing. I'm actually still on Twitter, but a long time ago, I made the decision that I wasn't on Twitter because I thought it was going to move the needle for my books. I was on Twitter to interact with people.
Mhm.
And as long as I still had people who I liked, who I could interact with there, whom I might not be able to find elsewhere, I would stay. So far, I'm still there. There's a lot of blocking, a lot of muting, and it's actually okay. But I'm not doing it. Even someone like John Scalzi, who has this very popular blog and a very, huge Twitter following, and I may be misquoting or misparaphrasing him, but he's pointed out that he has a lot of people who read his blog and follow him on Twitter who aren't interested in his books. They just find him entertaining. And that's fine, right? So you do that for that reason, not because you think that you carry that whole burden. I think one of the hardest parts of the publishing scene, or of publishing and trad publishing, traditional publishing, is the writer can often feel like they carry that whole burden of like, if the book does well, then that was the publisher did it. But if it does badly, it's all my fault. I should have done more. And if there was just more I could do,
The publisher will also blame you.
well, yeah, that's convenient for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, and that's why that's why many people do self-publishing, because they would rather have that control in their own hands. For me, it's like too exhausting to think about doing all those other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for people who can do it, I say more power to them.
Totally.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about A Scatter of Light, which I loved.
Oh, thank you.
It's such, I remember you talking about it when you were writing it, because you were worried because the it's not a love story really, and it's not a romance. The relationship in it is kind of, I don't want to say it's ill-advised. Is that the good word? It's
totally not a good idea.
ill-advised.
Yeah.
And at the time when you were writing it, you were worried that that wasn't going to fly. I personally thought it was so realistic to being 18, that age, college, and making bad decisions. But I want to come back to this idea about timing. Maybe it wasn't the right time in 2014. Maybe things changed enough in the interim, in addition to the National Book Award, obviously, that changed your profile. But can you talk a little bit about how books sometimes come too late or too soon?
I definitely agree that it was not the right time in 2014. I think that it was YA was not ready for something like that in 20, it was too far advanced for YA of 2014, but literally a brief, like 7, 8 years later, 8 years, I can't do math. It was, the time was better, okay, because it had
yeah,
become much more, um, it was a better time for it. And it might have come in a very narrow window because knowing everything that is happening now with all the
yeah,
book banning
yeah,
and the fear of sexuality in
yeah.
young adult books, maybe now the time is not good for it again. I mean, it might have come out in the very brief window that it could have come out. Um, and I also think that at the time I was not skilled enough to write it well in 2014. I didn't know how to do it. Um, but writing I wrote 2 books between the original draft of Scatter of Light and the final draft of it. I wrote A Line in the Dark, which is my psychological thriller, and I
Mhm.
wrote Telegraph Club. And writing those 2 books absolutely improved me as a writer in terms of my craft. So when I went back to revise it, to revise A Scatter of Light, I could see very clearly the problems and the holes and what needed to be fixed, and I could make it better. I had more skills.
That's the other thing that sometimes we have to, I guess whatever, we have to be able to look at rejection as not an ending, but a possibility. Like if we can find a way, it's like, okay, I'm going to set this aside for a little while. I'm going to come back to it later. Or maybe there's something about this that isn't working well. Or um, even sometimes saying, this book is a good book, even though it didn't sell. It just came out at the wrong time. I mean, instead of this constant self-blame, because what we can do is we can work to learn how to write better.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's very important as a writer that you write, well, I'll speak for me. I want to write the best book I can
Yeah,
write
yeah,
every time I'm writing
yeah,
a novel. Because
yep.
when I finish writing that book, I may not feel like I did at the end of Telegraph Club where I think I did a good job with this book, but I want to be able to feel that I did the best I could, you
Yeah,
know? So that I feel I have felt that way with every book. I have no desire to go back and change any of them.
I'm the same. Yeah.
Yeah, even though I
Peop-
know I'm better now, I would do things differently now than I did with earlier books then. But I did the best I could at the time. So I like hearing about those. This is a little bit different, but hearing about like the estate of Ursula K. Le Guin and changing some of the language in her books to bring them up to date, or you
Did Le
know,
Guin's estate do that?
yep,
Or
the
was
Le
it
Guin's
Roald
estate
Dahl?
did.
I thought it was Roald Dahl.
His estate also
I
did.
know his did, but
Yeah, like that stuff, I don't know, I feel like I should issue some kind of like will that says do not do that, because I just think that the books that I wrote that was published in like 2011, for example, is a representation of what life was like in
yeah,
2011. Like even though it's a fantasy novel,
yeah.
it's from 2011 and it should always be from 2011, you know?
I feel like, yeah, I feel exactly the same. Sometimes people say, well, if you went back and did Crown of Stars, what would you do differently? Well, Crown of Stars is 7 volumes. I could go through now and cut 10% of the verbiage without changing anything, just by cutting, there's 3 descriptions of the village, and I could have done it with 1, right? But to me, this is my life's work. You can watch me as a writer change
Yeah,
over the course of these books. Why do I want to go back? Why do I want to go back and change that history? That's my life, right? And also because it represents who I was at that time. I can't write that book anymore. I couldn't write Geron now. I just couldn't do it. And I'm glad I wrote it then. But the other reason is I have other things I want to write. Why would I want to spend time revising things that when I have these other ideas, I want to keep moving forward. I want to quickly say, if anyone has a question, please put it in the Q&A. This
I
is the
know
time.
I went on for very long about my publishing journey, so sorry.
No, not at all. Because it's so important to see to see the ways, I don't even know how to say this, to see how important it is to like refocus our ideas on what we have to do or what we ought to do. It's not even have to do, but what we ought to do. And what we ought to do, in my opinion, is to be true to the book we're trying to write now and the ones we hope to write in the future.
Absolutely. I agree with
I
that.
don't, I don't know what else there is besides that. I think everything else is pretty much out of our control.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I mean, I have seen how much out of my control it is. You know?
And I don't mind people, like when people want to make swag, right? I think it's
yeah.
fine to make swag, but don't do it believing that somehow if you get the right swag, it's gonna, do it because you want to. Do it because you want to reward your readers, which is a good enough reason.
Right. And that's why, even though I quit Twitter and I'm not on social media much anymore, I still have my newsletter. I've had my newsletter since the beginning, I think. And I do that because I like to have a way to communicate with my readers. And
Yeah.
I have, thousands of readers who've been reading me for over a decade now. And I like to have a way to communicate with them directly that is not mediated by some giant internet corporation,
Yeah.
and I do things like make bookmarks for them or send them free books when I can and answer their questions. And I can do that in a forum that I control.
Yeah,
That
I
is
think
direct
that,
from me.
nurturing the relationship with the readers you have, to
Mhm.
me, is very precious, because readers are precious to me. They're also obviously the best readers because they like my books. But yeah, and a newsletter, that is the one thing I do recommend. But, well, actually two things. One is, do have at least a basic, if you can, have a basic website, even if it just lists what you have
Yes.
available, so that people can go there and find it. And then if, a newsletter can be just publicity, it can be chatty, it can be whatever you want, but it's a means for you to communicate with them.
Yes. And for example, I love seeing pictures of Finn in your newsletter.
Yes, and
Always look
where is he?
forward
Oh,
to the outcome.
he's over on the chair. Yeah, so
Yeah,
he's huddled up on the chair like so
like Leia. There she is.
low.
I should
Yeah,
start putting a photo of my dog in my newsletter.
you should. Everyone who has a pet should put a photo of their pet in their newsletter, in my opinion. All right. Oh my gosh, people, questions. They're just listening to us. It's kind of scary. Okay, I have like 4 pages of notes and I haven't even turned the first page.
Because I went on for so long about my lengthy.
No. That's why I brought you here. Stop it. Stop it. Find your inner Leo, Malinda.
That's right.
As
I
a
deserve to
fellow
have
Leo,
spoken.
I'm like, okay. Okay, did you sit down? Oh, I want to talk. Can we talk just a little bit about dreams and expectations and how they can be both good and bad? How they can harm us, but also help us. Do you have any thoughts about that? That it's important not to downplay yourself too much, but it's also, I think, important not to get stuck on saying it only counts as successful. My book is only successful if it's on the New York Times list.
Oh,
But
I
books
never
are
think that. Because
successful
the
in
New
lots
York
of
Times
ways.
list is completely manipulated. Okay. So anybody who thinks the New York Times list is a marker of a book's quality or whatever, it is not. It has nothing to do with whether your book is good. I really want to emphasize that. It is not about that. So dreams, I think that is it important to believe in yourself as a writer and to believe that you can do the thing you want to do. Like the next book I want to write is ambitious, and I believe I can do it.
You can.
I
You
believe
can.
I can
I
do it.
believe you can do it.
I believe I can do it. At the same time, I feel as a writer in traditional publishing, it is very important to be realistic about my
Mhm.
expectations.
Yeah.
And I'm fortunate in that I have a literary agent who is very direct and tells me bad news all the time. So, I've had a lot of experience of ups and downs in publishing. And although I won the National Book Award, I won it in young people's literature. Okay. And I will say that my next book is not young adult literature. And those who are not in YA don't care about YA. So all of my awards are in YA. Does that translate into adult fiction? I don't really think it does very much. I don't think they care. In fact, a lot of adults kind of think YA sucks. So my entire career has been like, oh, people like my YA, people like it, but then a lot of people hate YA. So I really try to approach this with realistic expectations. Like I am hopeful that people will like my next book. I believe it is ambitious. I do believe I can do it, but I have no idea how the success of Telegraph Club will translate. You know what I mean?
Right.
I have
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
So
We never know. We all have heard stories of people who were on top of the world, and 3 years later they couldn't get a book deal.
yeah,
Right. You see, and people who said, oh, I always love to bring up Martha Wells, who is a friend of mine, who's a wonderful writer, and she thought her career was over, like literally dead. She thought that was it, that she'd written her last book, and so she wrote one more little thing, right? And that became this international best-selling series, the Murderbot series. Martha had no idea. It's like, I'm sorry, I have to use this rather strange example. Excuse me. I saw a clip of Jimin, the BTS singer, on Jimmy Fallon, and Jimmy Fallon says, "Did any of you expect this level of success?" And I have to say, quite sincerely, he wasn't acting. He said in Korean, he said, "No, absolutely not." It was just, you just don't know.
no.
And so, which is, I think, why focusing on the excitement of what you're doing, right? The excitement, the challenge of what you're doing, you're going to do something you haven't done before.
Yes.
I mean, how exciting is that? And how exciting is it to build on everything you've done before to do something that's going to use all those skills? I mean, that to me is like almost the most exciting thing about writing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'm on the same wavelength as you.
Yeah,
so
yeah, we're very much, yeah.
I totally agree. That is what is exciting about taking your experience and moving to another level with it. That's what I have always wanted to do. And I hope to continue doing it, as long as I can. So
That's all we want. And that's also, I think, the thing that I worry about, the focus on debut novels as a commercial element. When debut novels are fine because they're the beginning, but to me, what I love most is, or what I hope for people, is that you can see their creativity across a lifetime. I was, a few years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and I went to the I think they took the Sackler name off the Asian Art Museum and something else. Yeah. But they had an exhibit of, I believe it was Hokusai, the Japanese artist who's best known for his, for the wave and those things. And it was just work from his 80s and 90s.
Oh, that's great.
And also and it was amazing. And also recently, a Honolulu-based sculptor whose name I'm blanking on, he did an art exhibit. He's in his 90s, and he did an art exhibit of work across his life. And I took my son and went, and he was there giving 5-minute lessons to people. And I can't deal with that, right? But I made my son go, and he's like he's sending clips to his sister, and she's like, "I can't believe you get to do this. You're not even an artist." Because she was so, but to me, I look at these things and I think, this is a life. How great is that we can be creative and have these changes across our whole life?
I agree. I totally agree. I don't want to stagnate, and be doing the same thing. I mean, there are writers, and I admire them, who can write a variation on a theme for a career, and a lot of times publishing loves those writers because they're easier to promote. you know?
Yeah.
But I'm not that kind of writer, so I have to kind of embrace the fact that I'm going to do a different thing every time. And I'm very happy now that I'm working with an editor who's willing to go there with me, and I have an agent who's supportive of this, and I have my wife who has supported me throughout. So, I'm just going to keep going, I guess. What else
And
are you
that's
going to do?
and that actually is a great place to stop. We're just going to keep going. And that's ultimately the one thing we can control more than anything else. We can keep going.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you. I'm thrilled. I'm excited to read this. I know a little tiny bit about it, and I'm excited to read more. I want to thank everyone here listening today, even though you didn't ask any questions. I don't know, man. That's all right. I want to thank everyone who was watching this on YouTube. I want to thank Nathan Lucas, who has been tech person for 3 seasons now, and SFWA for providing the platform. The next thing up is a writing date with Arlie Sorg. Arlie, if you're there. Hi, Arlie. Hello. And thank you again. Thank you, Malinda. This has been great. I'm actually really thrilled for everything that you've dealt with, although I'm sorry it was so exhausting.
I'm winding down now. I'm
Yeah.
going to Germany in July on
Cool.
to a German book festival, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to go
Wow.
on a high note. So, I mean, I'll be back. I'm just like taking.
Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. And I'm going to do the 3-second pause so that they can cut this there, although we'll still be recording.